My family and I had always looked forward to our summers at Grandpa's house in California. A vast walnut orchard stretched for miles around the house, nestled deep in the countryside, far away from the bustling cities. The isolation gave the place a serene charm, though sometimes, especially at dusk, it felt unsettling. This summer was no different. My mother, father, older brother James and I made the long drive to Grandpa's house, eager to spend time with him. He was a quiet but wise old man, always treating his orchard with reverence and respect, as though it held more than just trees. Grandpa had lived in that house for as long as I could remember. It had belonged to his father before him, and generations of our family had passed through its weathered doors. The orchard was his pride and joy, and he often warned us to be careful when exploring it. "There are things in those trees that are older than you think," he would say, his eyes distant. We always shrugged it off as part of his old-world beliefs. The orchard itself was mesmerizing. Ancient walnut trees with branches that twisted and turned like gnarled fingers. Some trees were so thick and tall, they seemed to scrape the sky. Grandpa often told us stories about the land, claiming it had a history that stretched back centuries. He always ended his tales with a firm warning: respect the trees or they'll make you regret it. That particular summer, my Uncle Sam and my cousins were also visiting. One hot afternoon, Uncle Sam suggested we all head to the orchard to gather walnuts. He figured it would be a thrilling activity for us kids, as the trees were heavy with ripe nuts. Armed with baskets, my cousins James and I followed Uncle Sam into the heart of the grove. The sunlight filtered through the canopy of leaves, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The deeper we went, the quieter it became, as though the trees themselves were watching. "Let's shake down the walnuts," Uncle Sam announced, his voice cutting through the stillness. He gave one of the massive trees a firm shake, and soon walnuts rained down around us. My cousins and I scrambled to pick them up, our laughter echoing through the orchard. James, being older and more adventurous, wandered a little further than the rest of us, drawn by a pile of walnuts scattered under a distant tree. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I saw him stop, frozen mid-step. He bent down to pick up a walnut, but just as his fingers grazed it, the walnut vanished, disappearing into the ground as though it had never been there. Confused, James crouched lower, reaching for another walnut nearby. But before he could touch it, two disembodied hands appeared in the air. They were grotesque, with long skeletal fingers and jagged nails. The hands floated just above the ground, hovering ominously in front of him. James stared at his hands in horror, unable to move. His face turned pale and his lips parted in a silent scream. Then, slowly, the hands curled their bony fingers, beckoning him closer. He obeyed, as though entranced, his body stiff and mechanical. He turned away from the rest of us without a word and began walking deeper into the orchard, his movements slow and deliberate. I watched in confusion, wondering what he was doing. My cousins were still busy collecting walnuts, oblivious to what was happening. It wasn't until Uncle Sam noticed James walking away that the alarm set in. "Where's James going?" Uncle Sam asked, squinting into the distance. We all stopped and turned to see James heading in the opposite direction, toward the old cemetery at the edge of the orchard. The cemetery had been there for as long as anyone could remember, a place of quiet solitude with headstones weathered by time. "James," Uncle Sam called, his voice rising with concern. James didn't respond. He just kept walking, his steps eerily slow, his body moving as if pulled by some unseen force. Panic surged through me, and we all started running after him. Uncle Sam was the first to reach him, grabbing his arm and spinning him around. "Where are you going?" he demanded, shaking him slightly. But James didn't answer. His eyes were wide and vacant. His face was devoid of color. He looked at Uncle Sam but didn't seem to recognize him or any of us. His lips twitched, but no words came out. "What's wrong with you?" Uncle Sam asked, his voice trembling now. But James remained silent, his body stiff and unresponsive. His eyes, once full of life, now glowed a faint red, as though something otherworldly had taken root inside him. We all stood there, frozen in fear, unsure of what to do. Then, without warning, James began walking again, this time directly toward the cemetery gates. Uncle Sam grabbed him again, this time more forcefully, and pulled him back toward the house. "We're going back," he said firmly, though his voice wavered with unease. As we made our way back to Grandpa's house, James walked in silence, his head down, his movements slow and deliberate. I tried talking to him, asking what had happened, but he wouldn't respond. He was distant, lost in his own world, and it terrified me. When we finally reached the house, Grandpa took one look at James and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, his voice grave. "He's not acting right," Uncle Sam explained. "He was heading toward the cemetery, and he won't talk." Grandpa's face darkened, and he exchanged a look with my grandmother. "Bring him inside," he said. We led James into the house, and as soon as we were inside, he stopped walking. He stood in the center of the living room, his face pale and his eyes glowing an eerie red. Then, in a voice that wasn't his own, he said, "I need food, now." It wasn't a request, it was a command, his voice low and thick, as though something else was speaking through him. James's tone surprised my father, who had always been strict with us. "It's not dinner time," my father said sternly. "You can wait." James's eyes flickered with anger, and he took a step toward my father. "I need food, now," he repeated, his voice even deeper and more menacing. Before my father could react, Grandpa stepped in. "Stop," he said, holding up a hand. "This isn't James." We all stared at Grandpa, confused. What did he mean? This isn't James. Grandpa turned to my grandmother. "Bring him food, now." My grandmother hurried to the kitchen, and within minutes she brought a plate of food for James. He sat down at the table, but the way he ate was disturbing. He shoveled food into his mouth with one hand while spitting it out with the other, as though something inside him was rejecting it. Grandpa watched closely, his face lined with worry. After a few moments, he spoke again. "We need help. Call the healer." The healer was an old woman from the village, known for her knowledge of spirits and the supernatural. When she arrived, she took one look at James and knew what had happened. "Something from the orchard is inside him," she said, her voice calm but serious. "Something from the orchard is inside him." The healer asked for water and blessed it with a prayer. She sprinkled the holy water on James's face, and that's when everything changed. James screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that filled the room with terror. His body convulsed, and his eyes glowed brighter, burning with a red-hot intensity. Then, in a voice that wasn't his own, he began to speak. "I like this boy," the spirit inside him said. "He is handsome. I will not leave him." The healer didn't flinch. "Why have you possessed him?" she asked, her voice steady. The spirit hissed. "He stood where my son's spirit died. That place is sacred to me. Anyone who disturbs it will suffer." "He didn't know," the healer said gently. "He is innocent." "I don't care," the spirit snarled. "He will pay." The healer began chanting, her voice low and melodic. She recited verses from her sacred texts, and with each word, the spirit inside James screamed in agony. It begged for mercy, but the healer didn't stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the spirit let out one last blood-curdling scream and left James's body. He collapsed into the floor, unconscious but alive. The healer kneeled beside him, placing a hand on his forehead. "He will be weak for a while," she said softly, "but he will recover." Grandpa thanked the healer, his eyes brimming with gratitude. As for James, it took weeks for him to fully return to his normal self. He had no memory of what happened, but he felt sad afterward, as if the spirit had stained his soul. We never went back to the orchard after that day. The trees, once a place of adventure and joy, had become a place of fear and darkness. Grandpa eventually sold the land, leaving the orchard to grow wild and untamed. But even now, years later, I still hear the echoes of that summer in my dreams. The disembodied hands, the graveyard, and the voice that had taken over my brother. Those memories haunt me, serving as a chilling reminder to never disturb certain places, no matter how much it may seem fitting.